Hey, here we are again, second part of my two-part bit about mounting bonnets and cap badges. Putting the tartan patch on the Khaki Bonnet. The Khaki Bonnet is a relatively recent introduction. It was introduced in the fall of 1915 because the Glengarry bonnet proved unsuitable for the trenches. For two things: it got extremely dirty very quickly, and B, it's colorful and distinctive and made a very attractive aiming mark for enemy marksmen. So away went the Glen. They wore it when they were out of the line, but in the trenches they introduced the Khaki Bonnet. Originally it was quite a bit bigger than it is now. It provided some protection to the eyes. The other ranks pattern is a darker material because it was an army contract, and it's probably the same material that was used for the soldiers' coats and overcoats. Officers, because they bought their own stuff, they wouldn't have, of course, like this material like this in a bespoke tailoring shop. So they've got camel, which would be used for very beautiful top coats. So the officers' TOS is differently colored. I'm a little nervous about that because, once again, we've introduced an identifiable aiming mark for enemy snipers, but we don't wear these in the line anymore, do we? To sight the tartan patch. Incidentally, the tartan patch was introduced by the troops. Initially, badges were just mounted directly on. Then, there's quite a few of them in the Seaforth Museum. The troops have put a fragment of tartan behind the badge. Generally, in the earliest ones, it's any old way, but it's an effort by the troops to look more smart, more distinctive. None of this stuff was dictated by the War Office or by NDHQ or whoever. It was the troops trying to look more smart. So to locate the badge, now I've got tartan patches, Seaforth tartan patches. Sell them at $3 each. Don't cut up your kilt. I'll provide the patch. Properly mounted, the patch, as you can see, it's cut on the bias. It forms a saltire, also known as the St. Andrew's Cross. Properly mounted for the Seaforths, I don't care about you other guys, it forms a sort of a stair effect that the lines in the two stripes are horizontal rather than vertical, with the square in the center. Now, to correctly mount this thing, and we do it by eye. I stretch the bonnet tight with there's the back of the bonnet. The center of the bow should be at the center of the back of the head. We stretch it tight, and I determine the center, which is about here. And then I move it slightly forward of center, a width of a thumb, so-called rule of thumb, that's an inch. A little bit forward of center, and I've determined that's the right spot. That's by guess and by God, but it works. So as you can see, I've pinned it down. Now when I sew this, I'm left-handed. I'm going to use a needle and thread rather than a sewing machine because, as you can see this, and you can probably see the stitches, they're quite coarse. The purpose is to catch the edge of the raw material. If this is machine sewn, as the cloth moves around, the tartan patch is going to burst from the seam and it's going to look like hell. So I'm doing a needle and thread, rather large looping overhand stitch. Now I'm left-handed, so I start at the top and I work my way around to the other side. Now this bonnet is rather curiously cut because usually, as we can see with this, when I put the tartan patch on, I've mounted the tartan patch a little bit forward to center, and the lower edge is even with this seam. It's not dead flush with the brim. It's a little bit up. And that often leaves the top of the badge projecting up above the seam a bit, as we could see here. I started sewing here and I brought it around to the top. And at that point, I don't trim until then. So it was a little bit proud. I carefully trim it so that it matches the flow of the seam, and then I sew it down. There was a fashion back in the 70s when I joined the regiment that they would deliberately leave this long and fringed, possibly in emulation of the hackle that the Queensland Highlanders wore at the time. But there we go. We measure it, we correctly sight it so that it's level to the seam. If you're left-handed, you're starting at this corner and working up. If you're right-handed, you're starting here and working around, then cutting the top to suit, sewing that down. And I also sew a blind stitch across the X so that this cloth is firmly attached to, because otherwise it's going to balloon out. So there you go. You know what you have to do. Get to it. No mistakes in future. Carry on. Thank you.